We are on page 8 of the computer system notes. I should just mention that you're getting kind of the Coles Notes versions of computer architecture. In ECE, they do one course on digital circuits and then another course on processors and assembly programming, whereas you get most of that just in one course. So I'm just giving you some kind of high-level coverage of this stuff. It can come up in systems programming interviews, so for those of you who have that leaning, it's good to be familiar with the concepts at least. Okay, so now continuing on with caches. Usually there's more than one level of cache in a general purpose processor. So we have multiple cache levels. So for example, you might have the L1 cache, the L2 cache, and the L3 cache. So L just stands for level. So level 1, level 2, and so on. Actually, so in the bad old days, processors didn't have any cache, and they realized that memories were getting too slow, and so caches were these separate chips that were located on the PCB, the printed circuit board, close to where you mounted the processor, but then that's kind of, slow-ish. So then they got moved onto the processor, and then having one level of cache wasn't good enough. They needed more, and they wanted to be faster, so then they added extra levels. And so the way they work basically is that the smaller caches, so that would be, for example, the level 1 is going to be your smallest cache, are faster, and the larger caches, so for example the L3, if you've got an L3, hold more, obviously, so have higher hit rates. So they're not mafioso going around killing people. The hit rate refers to, on the previous page there, the first time the processor requested word C, it wasn't in the cache, so that was a miss, and that memory access took longer to satisfy. But then the second time it asked for word C or word D, it was already in the cache, and so that was a hit, and so it was satisfied faster. So let's just look at a typical modern two-core processor. So we've got processor 0, and beside it we've got processor 1, and you can actually look at diagrams of or you can look at images of the chips, and you can actually kind of see where the different processors are laid out. So it might not be exactly like this, but it gives you the idea. So processor 0 is going to have two small caches close to it. And so these are both level 1 caches. One is for instructions, so it's the L1I, and the other one is for the data. And that might seem a little weird, but processors nowadays are pipelined, and so they're trying to fetch instructions at the same time that they're working on other instructions that they've already fetched. So it needs to be able to get data and instructions in parallel. That's why there has to be separate level 1 instruction and data caches. And the size of these things, I'll add that in a minute, but they're maybe 32 kilobytes each, maybe 64 kilobytes, something like that. And then that's relatively small. You're not going to get a whole program fitting into your L1 instruction cache or all its data into the L1D cache. So there's a larger cache connected right below it, so the level 2 cache. So the processor, say it goes to fetch an instruction, it's going to see if it's in the level 1 cache. If it's not, the cache controller from the level 1 cache will talk to the cache controller, the level 2, and say, hey, do you have that data? And if it does, it gets passed up. Now the level 2 is bigger, but a little bit slower. And if it doesn't have the data, it's going to go down to the level 3 cache. So the level 3 cache is usually shared between multiple processors. So now we can finish this diagram. The two sides are supposed to be the same width. I just didn't draw it very well there. So processor 1 is going to have a level 1 instruction cache and a level 1 data cache of its own. It's going to have its own level 2 cache. Level 2 caches, when they don't have the data, they will go down to the level 3 cache and check to see if it has the data. And so let's just add a few annotations in green here. So this is the level 1 instruction cache, and that is the level 1 data cache. And so these caches, let's say you got a nice big processor and they're 64 kilobytes each. Their latency, surprisingly, is not 0 or 1 cycle. It's going to be more in the neighborhood of 4 cycles, so 4 cycle latency. That's just, if you got something that can hold 64 kilobytes, it's hard to make it retrieve the data within 1 processor clock cycle when your processor is clocked at 2, 3, 4 gigahertz. Now, they use lots of tricks in the pipeline of the processors to hide that latency. So instructions, a processor might overlap the execution of, the execution windows are in the neighborhood of about 100, maybe 150 instructions. So it'll be fetching and starting to decode a bunch of instructions. And in the meantime, older instructions could be like, 100 instructions ahead, are just being finished off. And so they have these large windows so that they can hide things like a miss in the level 1 or level 2 cache, and even just the latency of the level 1 cache. There's a lot of tricks. It's an interesting topic. If you were to take ECE 320, you'd learn about that in lots of detail. Okay, so now the level 2 caches, they're going to be in the neighborhood of something like half a megabyte, so 512 kilobytes. I forget which particular processor I was looking at here, but something pretty modern. And the latencies are in the neighborhood of 10 cycles. And then the level 3 cache, let's just say something like 8 megabytes and something like 40 cycle latency. And all the requests from the processor, they get put in, the requests between the levels of cache, they go through these FIFOs. And so if you miss in your L1 and your L2 and your L3 cache, these latencies all add up. So you're looking at maybe 54 cycle latency if you have to go all the way to the L3 cache, which is still better than, say, 400 cycles. Let's switch to blue here. If the L3 cache has to go down to main memory to get a block. And if you're buying server chips, so they're just like the more expensive versions, or maybe you're building a gaming system and you're willing to fork out $1,000 for a processor, there might actually be a 4th level, and they don't call it an L4 cache. It's embedded RAM, so it's going to be, I think it's actually embedded DRAM that's added as an extra layer, whereas the L1, 2, and 3 would probably all be SRAM.